Greetings and welcome to the University of Minnesota Alumni Association's webinar series. My name is Marissa Smith and I'm the Director of Student and Recent Alumni Relations. Thank you for joining us. Today's webinar is Demystifying Millennial Management, led by Hannah Ubel of Bridgeworks. Before we dive in, just a couple of announcements. Today's webinar is part of an ongoing free series being offered by the University of Minnesota Alumni Association, where we have conversations with experts about career, life, and learning topics. Initiatives like this webinar series are made possible in part by our Alumni Association members. So if you're a member out there listening, thank you. Because of our members, we exist. And if you're interested in joining the Alumni Association and supporting our work, you can check us out at umnalumni.org/membership. Starting tomorrow, we have a really exciting new opportunity debuting, an online store called the Minnesota Alumni Market. The Minnesota Alumni Market originated from a desire to help alumni businesses gain exposure in the alumni community. We have alumni all over the world who are creating home goods, creating books, owning breweries, and so this marketplace is our way of supporting those businesses and helping them foster new connections. So we're excited about the opportunities with this market, and hopefully you'll have a chance to check it out tomorrow. We have one more webinar coming up yet this fall on November 29th, The Art of Tactful Self-Promotion at Work, and look out for our spring webinars, which will be announced soon. Just a couple of housekeeping items about participating in today's event. So you have joined the presentation listening using your computer's speaker system by default. If you would prefer to listen over the telephone, just select telephone in the audio pane of your GoToWebinar panel and dial-in information will be displayed. If you experience any audio difficulties while listening via your computer speakers, this can be caused by having multiple software applications open, which can use up your computer's bandwidth and affect network performance. Listening on a wireless signal may affect performance as well. So feel free to go ahead and close any unnecessary applications on your computer. Questions are welcome during this webinar and you can submit them at any time. Please type your questions into the questions pane on the GoToWebinar control panel. We'll be monitoring them along the way, and we've also reserved some time at the end for questions. So this is going to be a fun conversation and we definitely want to hear from you. It's now my pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Hannah Ubel. Hannah is a writer, market researcher, and generational expert with Bridgeworks, a company that has been dedicated to bridging the generational divide in the workplace and marketplace for over 16 years. Through their cutting-edge research and best-selling books, Bridgeworks has helped some of the country's best companies through the inevitable clashes that can happen between traditionalists, baby boomers, Generation Xers, and millennials. From AARP to MTV, they have been called on by business executives, politicians, and the media to share their expertise. Hannah is a millennial who grew up watching Full House, dancing to Backstreet Boys songs, and has a vast collection of participation awards, including a 6th place Swin trophy. Today she is a renowned keynote speaker and we're thrilled to have her with us. Please welcome Hannah Ubel.
Perfect. All right, thank you so much, Marissa, and thank you everyone for logging on. I am excited to be here talking to you about my generation, millennials, and talking about other generations as well, because it's not just about millennials. But many times I do get the question about why are we talking about this? Why talking managing millennials? And Bridgeworks, the company I work for, we've been around for 20 years. So when the company started, it was because generational clashes existed between Gen Xers and baby boomers. Millennials like me were in elementary school. But fast forward 20 years, and now we're looking at this generation for a couple of reasons. One of them is that we're huge. By 2030, millennials will make up 75% of the global workforce. By 2020, millennials make up about 50% of the US workforce. So there's just a large number of millennials. And let's be honest, millennials do not have a very good brand, we will say. We like to say they have a bit of a PR problem, because if you log on to any website, you are going to see some sort of article that has a headline like this. If you think about the stereotypes you've heard about millennials, or maybe thought yourself from time to time, they're lazy, they're narcissistic, They cry when they get feedback. They're obsessed with their parents. They're overly sensitive. They still live in their parents' basement. They only drink kombucha. I mean, the list goes on and on and on. For those of you who are a millennial or work with millennials, you know that these stereotypes, for the most part, are not true. There are great millennials that you work with. Because there are so many stereotypes about millennials, there are many of the generation who don't even like being called a millennial. Pew Research actually found that about 75% of millennials hate being called that because of these terrible stereotypes. However, we have to keep talking about them in a sense because they do make up a large part of the workforce, and you're recruiting the best ones and retaining the best ones does impact the bottom line at businesses. According to a study from Deloitte, more than a third of millennials, they plan to leave their workplace in about 2 years. Now, the key word here is plan. That doesn't necessarily mean that they will, but the question is then, what can you do to make sure that you keep these millennials? We work a lot in the manufacturing workspace, and we are always examining the trades gap. And one thing that we look at is 3.5 million manufacturing jobs will be needed by 2020, and 2 million may go unfilled. So they're looking at the millennials and they're thinking, it costs me $14,000 on average for every open position I have, and I cannot attract this generation to the workforce. All of these challenges are what we study and what we focus on to ensure that businesses can improve the bottom line and improve their retention and recruiting the best of the best. So been talking a lot about millennials, and I haven't even said where they fall. This is how we break down generations at Bridgeworks. Traditionalists are born before 1946. They're also known as the silent generation or the GI generation or the greatest generation. They're only about 2% right now of the full-time workforce. Then we have baby boomers born between 46 and 64, huge group of 80 million. Gen Xers born between 65 and 79, a smaller group of 60 million. And millennials born between 80 and 95, also known as Generation Y. I often get asked what happened to Gen Y. It was put to a vote for millennials if they wanted to be a millennial or Gen Y, and we chose millennials. So for anyone who says, I don't think I'm a millennial, I'm a Gen Y, they're actually the same thing. And then, of course, after millennials is generation we call Gen Edge or Gen Z, a group that is showing to be very different from the millennial generation, and I will give a preview as to who they are at the end. Now, I am curious, for the people who are on the session right now, I just want to know what generation of folks I have on here. So there's going to be a poll here that's launched, and if you can please just select what generation you belong to. I'll give you about 10 to 15 seconds to do this. All right, looks like most of you have voted so far. All right. It looks like we have a pretty healthy mix of folks here. So we've got 40% Gen Xers, excellent, 35% of my own cohort, millennials, and 26% boomers. I will say, because this is a majority Gen X session, I usually find that Xers don't believe a lot of what I say until I start talking about them. So if you are an Xer, I am prepared for that. Also, a word to the millennials that are on the session. I will talk a little bit more about this, but one really important thing that we do is talk about how all millennials are not the same, and a 35-year-old millennial is very different from a 25-year-old millennial, so I will talk about that. There's lots of different nuances there. Okay, and then the one thing I really didn't mention was that if you feel like you're kind of between two generations, like you're sort of in one, sort of in another, we call you a cusper. And there's an entire chapter in our latest book, and it's called Cusper the Friendly Ghost. And it's called that because cuspers usually feel invisible. They're like, you know what, you keep talking about generations, but I do not feel like I even fit into one demographic. Cuspers are natural leaders, natural mediators, natural translators, because they easily see two perspectives at the same time. So if you are a cusper, we like to say that you are generationally bilingual, which of course you can add that as a skill on your LinkedIn profile. Everyone will know what it means. We also, I want to point this out too, because I think many times you look at generations and you can look at this topic and it instantly feels like you're getting put into a box. And that's really not what we are trying to do. What we look at and study is sociology. So we study the patterns and the trends that occur during formative years, so roughly your teenage years, and we study how that shapes who you are as an adult, how you work, how you collaborate, how you think. Because there are things that happen during those formative years that create lasting impacts that you carry with you for the rest of your life. So a couple examples of what this can look like. There are boomers on the session right now, and if I say NASA to a group of boomers, usually the first thing that comes into their head is this. It's the moon landing. I've heard stories from some boomers, and they say things like, it was incredible. They're like, they said, you know, we're going to put a man on the moon, and then it was going to happen, and we all gathered, and we went to the person's house down the street who had the color television, and they all gathered in the same room, only to find that it was in black and white. But there was this feeling of, oh my gosh, this is incredible. Look what we have accomplished. It's a sense of optimism, the sense of idealism. Now I asked Generation Xers on the session the same question. When I say NASA, what do you think of? And this usually pops into their heads. The Challenger explosion. And I hear really different stories from Gen Xers when they talk about NASA and their experiences. They say, yeah, we were all gathered together in school because there was a teacher on board, and the TV was rolled into the classroom, and that was usually the sign of a very good day if the TV was rolled into the classroom. But then when they watched this happen, I've had Xers say things to me like, I didn't know what was going on. I was confused. I didn't know if this picture right here, if that was supposed to happen. So there was a lot of questioning. And then all of the news coverage afterwards, it wasn't even answering any questions of what went wrong. It was raising more questions. So I've talked to a lot of Xers, and they say things like, you know, if I couldn't trust NASA, this amazing institution, who and what then could I trust? So it was really this beginning of questioning and skepticism for Gen Xers. Now, one other point of comparison, my millennial cohorts on this session, we might remember some posters that looked like this growing up. These accessory posters were everywhere. Teamwork, trees cross-pollinating in a field means collaboration. In addition to this, there were the signs that said, there is no I in team, and we're stronger together than we are alone. Like this was pushed into our brains constantly that you must do things as a group to succeed. And we really believed that. Gen Xers, bit of a different poster in your classrooms growing up, like hang in there. This cat just hanging on. I have to admit, when I first saw this poster and it was told to me that this was motivational, I didn't get it. I was like, I don't understand. This doesn't make sense. And I one time had a Gen X CFO, and he walked up to me and he showed me the background of his phone, and it was this poster. And I asked him, I was like, why? Why is it the background of your phone? And he said, well, you know, Hannah, sometimes things go wrong, and all you got to do in those times is just hang in there and get through it. And I was like, okay, fine, whatever works for you. But you can see that for one generation, the motivation is do things in groups, do things in teams, and you'll succeed. For another generation, it's hang in there, you might be by yourself, but you've got this on your own. It's two really different messages. And that's what we study, that's what we explore when we're looking at how does this shape the way that we work. So I'm going to be talking now about millennials in general, but before I do, I'm curious if there are any questions. And there will be time for questions at the end when I can kind of answer them collectively, but just right now, are there any big burning questions that anyone has? All right. Not seeing anything come in so far, but we'll keep an eye on it. All right. Let's just talk about millennials really quickly, thinking of the events and conditions that shaped the millennial generation. So millennials, growing up, you can see on the slide there are a lot of different things that impacted the millennial generation. One thing that comes up all the time, if I have a room full of 100 millennials and I'm giving them a training about generations, and I say, what do you remember growing up? The first thing that they say is 9/11. That is the biggest memory, it's the biggest moment in history every millennial remembers. And that's one of those events that every generation remembers where they were, Every generation remembers how it impacted them. But for millennials, it was happening at such a young age during their formative years. So what we see for millennials is that it was this moment of learning that the world is scary and that the country could be vulnerable. I've talked to some millennials and they said, I never knew what a draft was. I went home and I talked to my parents who they talk about the draft number in the Vietnam War. I'd never had that conversation before. So it was this real beginning of kind of a dose of reality in a way for millennials. And then if you look at what happened afterwards, I mean, if you look at the school shootings that happened, look at Columbine, you look at Virginia Tech, and you look at the countless other shootings that millennials have seen via technology, there's this real sense of the world is scary. So what happened is the adults in millennials' lives said, I want to make you feel safe because the world is scary. So there was an increase in public funding for guidance counselors in the United States when millennials were growing up. And I remember my guidance counselor, her name was Miss Guest, and she would come to the classroom and she would say, hi everyone, safe space, okay? How do you feel today? And we would talk about our feelings, and we would pass out warm fuzzies, which were cotton balls with glued on eyeballs with a piece of paper that had a compliment about people. And we would pass them out, and I remember thinking, this is so cheesy, but I feel kind of good. This is kind of nice. So it was just really reinforcing this idea of let's focus on the positive, let's focus on what makes you feel good, and let's talk about our feelings with everyone in every level, in every position of authority. So that's really influential for millennials. But the other big one that comes up constantly is technology. So you can see the AOL Instant Messenger screen here. And for many early millennials, this was the main mode of communication. Like this was the cool new way to talk to people. And you would go home after school and log on with the painfully slow dial-up and then talk to your friends and invent a new language with LOL and BRB and away messages and so many other things that millennials understand. And it was really a shift and a change. And that's what we study. We don't so much study the technology itself that came out for millennials, we study how fast it changed. So as an example of this, early millennials, when they first graduated from college, first when they were young, not graduated from college, they were working on something like this, the Macintosh computer. This beautiful computer stored 128 kilobytes. That is nothing. I one time had someone say to me that's about the size of 2 tweets on Twitter today, which I will say I was at a conference last weekend and there was a tech person who came up to me and he said, it's not quite 2 tweets, it's more like 400. And I was like, oh, okay, well that's a big difference, but also I see 400 tweets when I open up my phone instantly, so I still don't understand what was happening on this computer. But if you consider that the first generation iPhone came out when these early millennials graduated from college, and that first generation iPhone could download ringtones 10 times the size of the storage of the Macintosh computer. That is massive change in a very, very short amount of time. So millennials are often looked at as this generation that is impatient. They want to change things all the time. They're highly disruptive. But if you grow up in an era of change and disruption, of course you're going to believe and think and feel like that is the norm. So that's part of why millennials are always pushing back, always questioning, and always seeking change. Because if it isn't happening around them, it can feel like something's wrong and they'll take it upon themselves to create that change. So overall for millennials, as a group, they are collaborative, diverse, socially accepting, and tech savvy. All right, now I'm going to talk about managing this generation. And when we think about managing millennials, there's oftentimes these blind spots where, you know, you're in your own generational zone, you've got your own generational hat on, and it can sometimes be difficult to take that hat off and view the world through the eyes of another. So some of the blind spots that I will be talking about relate to motivation, communication, and recruiting. And I'm going to start with boomers. Now, I will say, when we think about managing through a generational lens, sometimes the easiest way to think about it is through your family. Because even though this topic is something that we might feel in a work environment, where we sometimes feel the generational differences the most is with our own family. And that's why when we talk about boomers managing millennials, we call it the parent trap. Now, I know what some of you might be thinking. Wow, that was an amazing movie that I watched all the time in my youth. Other people might be thinking this was the much better version of that movie. But when we think about this parent trap of boomers managing millennials, the first place to understand this dynamic is to understand boomers. On the slide right now are some events and conditions that shaped baby boomers growing up. Now, these are US-centric events and conditions, and we do work globally, but this is a more US-focused conversation. So when we think about boomers growing up, what shaped them, a lot of things come to mind. Now, this is a giant generation. Between 48 and 64, a baby was born every 8 seconds, and boomers really felt the power of their numbers growing up. During the 1960s, it was a time of change. It was the first time that leaders were looking to the youth demographic to change the world, and that had never happened before. So if you look at leaders like JFK, Bobby Kennedy, Martin Luther King Jr., Gloria Steinem, all of them were calling on the youth to say, hey, some stuff is going on right now in this country, and it's not okay, and it needs to change, and I want you to help me. When I talk to boomers who were in their formative years during this time and during the 1960s, they say things like, I felt empowered. I actually felt like I could change the world. So there's this real drive and this mission and this vision and optimism that fueled boomers that they still carry with them today. If you look at mission statements and organizations, those were written by boomers for the first time because they believe in that collective mission and goal. Now, sometimes when I describe kind of that feeling of the counterculture revolution in the 60s, there are boomers who look at me and they're like, yeah, I was 5. I do not remember some of that stuff that was going on. I remember in the 1970s when there was stagflation. I remember that the economy went down. There weren't enough books in school. There weren't enough desks. Came time to go to work, there weren't enough jobs. And that was the reality for boomers who were growing up more in the 70s. And it created this feeling of needing to keep up with the Joneses. So if you've heard that before, Generation Jones falls into this baby boomer demographic because there's this competitiveness for boomers. And if you are a boomer, or if you're not, you've seen this before, right? Boomers, they show up to work and they check their personal life at the door and walk in professionally. They're wearing the right things, saying the right things, knowing who to talk to, how to talk to them, how to read body language, how to read tone of voice, later on how to write emails and ensure that every single person's name is either alphabetical or in order of importance. I mean, there's just so much of the written and unwritten rules that these boomers mastered. So as a generation, they are optimistic, idealistic, and highly competitive. Now, when it comes to boomers managing millennials, there are a lot of strengths because the parent-child dynamic is usually kind of ingrained into that relationship. They can see eye to eye on a lot of things. So one of those is there is this shared optimism, this can-do kind of attitude, this belief in if we all are following the mission, then we're following the right path. Let's push this boulder up the hill together. Millennials are known for erring on the side of positive, erring on the side of optimistic, and so this is somewhere where boomers and millennials, they can really relate to one another. However, there are some pitfalls as well. One of the biggest questions that we get from boomer owners and leaders and managers is, why is it that what motivates me doesn't motivate them? And this is a really good question because in the past, motivation was pretty simple. If you didn't work and you didn't do a good job, you didn't get a paycheck and you didn't eat and you didn't get food on the table for your family. That is pretty solid motivation. It's pretty simple to know what you need to do to get ahead. But this is where we can kind of run into a blind spot when it comes to motivation because what worked in the past doesn't necessarily work anymore when it comes to motivating millennials. I'm going to give you another example. Some of you might recognize this poster. Justification for a higher education. This was a very popular poster in the 70s and 80s. And I have talked to some boomers, some later boomers and Gen Xers who say things to me like, yes, I had this poster hanging up in my dorm room. It was in my room growing up. Like, that was the dream. And I saw this for the first time and I was like, gross, why is this the dream? Oh my gosh, I mean, you have so many cars. Why? You don't need all of those. This kind of goal that is pictured on this poster that might not be exactly what motivated other generations, but when we at Bridgeworks, we put different generations in a corner and we ask them collectively to answer this question: what gets you out of bed in the morning? And there routinely are very similar answers in how they respond. Baby boomers usually say things like responsibility, duty to my team, and ensuring that we're the best of the best. Gen Xers, the first word out of their mouths is money. And then that's quickly followed by, well, money because it lets me do all the things I need to do, it lets me take care of my family. And then millennials, when we say, what gets you out of bed in the morning? Money is usually the third or fourth thing that they talk about, because to them, money's important, but it's not number one. So we hear things a lot of times from managers like this. I was at a session once, and it was for new hires, and there was this really wonderful manager that walked to the front of the room, and he wanted to inspire these 23-year-olds. So he got up to the front of the room, and this is what he said: it's going to be tough work at first, but you'll see, it'll be so worthwhile once you start realizing how much money you're going to make. And I could see all the faces of these 23-year-olds just kind of confused. They're like, well, they didn't know how to respond, because to them it's like, okay, great, but what else? Millennials were not raised to value money in the same way. And the main reason why is because adults in their lives growing up said, if you are going to work as long and as hard as I did, you better do something that matters. You've got to do something you're passionate about. If you're doing something you'll love, you'll never feel like you're working a day in your life. So this is where we get to this idea that there are many things that motivate millennials other than money. Now, don't get me wrong. Truly, millennials like money. You can't pay them in like hugs and tokens and gratitude. That's not going to work. They want money. But it's not necessarily what's going to keep them in your organization. So I'm not going to go through all 10 things that motivate millennials other than money. We do have a list about that. I'm going to go through 2 just for the sake of time. One of them, if you're compensating the non-compensation generation, focus on purpose-driven work. Now, what I mean by this can kind of be boiled down to this study that was done by Deloitte. They asked, what is the purpose of business? And on the left, you can see here, this is how business leaders responded. It's pretty clear that the most important purpose of business is profit. And if any of you are leaders or owners or managers or look at a budget, you know that profit is critical to business success. Millennials were asked the same question, and this is how they responded. The biggest word is societal development. I have been asked before, people look at this and they're like, what does that even mean? I don't understand. And I mean, if you look at it, it's not as giant as profit, but profit is on there. They want to change the world for the better. So what this really boils down to is that if you are leading this generation, if you are managing them, and you're trying to motivate them to do great work, saying something like, you are going to make so much money, that's why you should do this. Saying something like, well, we are the best in the business in what we do, and therefore, that's why you should be motivated to do great work. All of that is not going to work. What will work is if you lead with why. If you say, this is why we do what we do, and this is how you are a part of that. And that's kind of turning this quote around to say, it's going to be tough work, but we'll get through it as a team. We're doing this to improve blank so that blank. I was recently with WEMA. WEMA is the Water and Wastewater Equipment Manufacturers Association. So essentially what they do is they make sure that water is clean. Okay, that is a pretty important job, but it is not a very sexy industry. Okay, we're talking manufacturing and being in very dirty water and making it clean, and we're talking wastewater. Like, this isn't Google, right? So I was with them, and there was one person who said, you know, I've got a really high millennial workforce. He's like, we make pipes. We make things that are not very attractive and exciting. But he realized that for a while what he was doing is to increase sales of his products. He would just say, this is the number we're trying to get at. We want to keep improving. We want to keep growing. The company's on a great trajectory. Everyone needs our product. And it wasn't working. So he decided about a month later, he said, I'm going to change the way I talk about this. And he said, the more products that we sell, the more crud we clean out of water. And that slight little shift completely changed the dynamic in the workforce, where the sales staff and everyone else took it upon themselves to create a chart that was like a dirty lake, and when they made more sales, they would remove pieces of paper that looked like dirt to make the water look clean, and it was blue underneath. So now it's this wonderful visual goal. Everyone's motivated because they're working on something fantastic, and it's all just because he slightly tweaked what he was saying to connect it to the why. Now, that's really one of the most important things I would say with motivating millennials. But the second one here is about career progression. This comes up all the time. I will say right now, millennials, where they're at in their life stage, they're looking for career progression. That's pretty normal, but it is different than generations in the past. So right now, 50% of millennials rate opportunity for advancement as extremely important when applying for a job. 60% rate the opportunity to learn and grow as extremely important. And this is true in every kind of work environment. Millennial blue-collar workers indicated significantly higher expectations for career advancement compared to Xers and Boomers. So essentially what we're seeing is that if they don't have the opportunity to grow, they're going to look elsewhere for a new job. Growth doesn't look the way that it did in the past. In the past, you started at the bottom and you worked 5, 10 years, put your head down, did really good work, proved yourself, and then you would move up to the next level. And it was a pretty linear trajectory. Now, millennials are looking for the opportunity to bounce around to different things all the time. And this is where I would say something you can do is to provide micro moves over macro promotions. Millennials are not looking to make these big, giant leaps. They just want to know that they can keep moving and keep growing. And there's a lot of different ways to do this. You can have a rotational program where on a 3-year basis, each year you move a millennial into a different department so they have exposure to different areas of the business. You can also look at it as changing their title from time to time. Don't change it dramatically and into something that's completely meaningless, because millennials can read through that. But if you change their title and give them 2 extra responsibilities, that will feel like growth, and they will really feel like they are getting that message that you as an employer value them. One other example, I kind of keep talking about the manufacturing space, but this is something where we're really diving into the research right now. And there was one company who in a facility, they make boxes. So again, not very sexy work, but he said that there's 4 different jobs when you are making a box. And what he started doing is he would rotate people through those different jobs on a quarterly basis. So 1 month you're die cutting, 1 month you're assembling, and so on and so on. So when he started doing this, he said that instantly people had a different view and lens of the work that they were doing. It motivated them more because they could see the steps before and after their work. And it's so successful that now there are similar manufacturing facilities in his area that offer $2 more an hour, but they don't offer that kind of micro move. So people want to work for him first. He has people waiting on his wait list to hire, where these other people are struggling to fill positions. So it really can be powerful, and it doesn't have to be drastic. And if you're not sure exactly of how to do it, ask a millennial there what they would like to do for their next micro move. All right, that is baby boomers. Just going to check really quickly if there's any questions before we get into Generation Xers. Okay, yep, there was just a quick question about getting a link to the recording, and you will get a link to the recording. So you will get that information. All right. Well, there still will be more time to ask questions. All right, next up, Gen Xers. We like to call this the annoying little sibling relationship, because on paper, Xers and millennials should get along. They're closer in age, they have a lot of similarities, but it is one of the places where we see the biggest generational collisions at work. It's not between boomers and millennials, it's between Xers and millennials. Gen Xers. Let's just start briefly talking about what shaped you growing up. Technology was a huge shift and change for Gen Xers growing up. I've talked to a lot of Xers and they're like, yeah, it was awesome. We used computers, we had the internet, we had pagers. Some Xers I've talked to, they're like, yeah, you had a pager if you were really cool, or if you're maybe a drug dealer. But it completely redefined how this generation communicated. So with that change in technology was also change in exposure to media. This is also known as the MTV generation. Cable television came out, and by the time an average Xer turned 20, they'd watched 23,000 hours of television. That is a lot of time growing up watching TV. And I've talked to a lot of Xers who say things like, you know, I was watching Saturday morning cartoons, and I was watching Michael Jordan, but I was also watching CNN, and Ted Turner, 24-hour news. And in those news stories, every single institution was crumbling in front of their eyes. If you think about Enron, about WorldCom, think about politics. This generation is old enough to remember one president saying, "I am not a crook," and young enough to remember another president saying other things, neither of which were true. And then Gen Xers saw Milli Vanilli wasn't even singing, so they were like, okay, cool, so I cannot trust politicians, I can't trust companies, I can't necessarily trust my parents, I can't trust pop stars. Who can I trust? Myself. They learned to poke holes and push back and ask questions from a young age. And today at work, that's what they do too. People will be getting a question out of their mouth, one of the first things they do is push back and ask questions. This is also the latchkey kid generation. So when they were growing up, they were very comfortable being by themselves and functioning alone after school. They were told if you want something done right, do it yourself, and that's still how they live and breathe and work today. All right, so let's talk about some of the strengths with Gen Xers managing millennials. One of the strengths that we look at is a little bit of that questioning. Xers, they change the buying and selling economy. In the past, y'all probably recognize this Fuller Brush man. This was essentially understood that if this Fuller Brush man came to your house, it was really on you to ensure that you were buying a good product. He could kind of say whatever he wanted to say. Later on, the salesperson changed to the sleazy used car salesman, and in response, Gen Xers said, anything I buy, any service I use, I want to ensure that it is trusted and peer-reviewed. So they created every single review site that we all use today. And this is a strength between Xers and millennials. Xers tend to be very transparent in their management style, and millennials love that. They're like, great, keep it real, be very honest with me, I crave that. Now there are pitfalls, however. Gen Xers will many times say things like, I don't want to hold your hand. And I was told this once by one of my first managers. She said, Hannah, this is great, this is gonna be a good relationship. The only most important thing you must know is I don't want to hold your hand. And I was like, cool. I don't know what that means. But where she was coming from is, in the past for Xers, this is the campaign. Just do it. Just get it done. Just figure it out. I don't care how you do it. Just do it. Again, millennials growing up, we had a different Nike campaign. We had Live Strong, we are more than one. It was about the collective and the group. So Gen Xers, when you set people on a project and you say, this is the result I want, sometimes for some millennials, especially younger millennials, you have to be really clear about your expectations. Set parameters, set a to-do list of the 5 expectations that you have to ensure that when a millennial is set to go and do what they need to do, instead of feeling paralyzed because they don't know what you expect, they feel motivated because they know exactly what you want them to do. Now the other pitfall that we look at is thanks. Let me explain what this means. I recently had a text conversation with my colleague Phil. I sent him this message. Yo, stupidly got up for 6 a.m. breakfast, restaurant's closed, thinking of heading out now to find a Starbucks, then is meeting you at the Hilton. Is that cool? Want us to get you anything? He responded, that's cool, no need to pick me up anything. I think they will have stuff at the meeting. Thanks. Period. I saw the period at the end of that thanks, and my mind started spinning. Because in my peer circle, if you put a period at the end of thanks, you're essentially saying, I'm kind of mad, we're going to fight about this later, I'm upset, you should know that, because no one does that, all right? So I was getting very concerned, I was getting very nervous that Phil was upset with me. So I responded, alrighty, well let me know if you change your mind, excited to see you present today, kill it, emoji. I may have overcompensated a little bit in my message. What happened is that I went to go see Phil. I went into a ballroom where he was speaking, and he came up to me and he hugged me and he said, Hannah, hey, it's so good to see you. It's like, oh, hold on a second. What do you mean you're so happy to see me? Your message made you sound so annoyed and mad. And he looked at me and he looked at the message and he was so confused. He was like, okay, right, well, I don't know, like grammar, maybe. I'm sorry. It's like, no, dude, it's fine. Now I know, okay? If you put a period at the end of thanks, it's all right. It's how you communicate. And this turns into a running joke for us where send him a message, he says, cool, period, thanks, period, emoji, 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 emoji. These little miscommunications can cause a blind spot when it comes to communication. How can you ensure that you're communicating in a way that other people can hear you? And the biggest breakdown we see happen between Gen X managers and millennials is when these honest, straight to the point Xers are giving feedback. When you are giving feedback to a millennial, you have to ensure that it's immediate and in the moment. 90% of millennials want feedback in real time. You should cushion the blow and ask questions. Now, cushion the blow does not mean a compliment sandwich. It is very, very obvious when a millennial is getting a compliment sandwich. And we do not need a trophy or a participation award for trying. Millennials want very specific feedback on what they are doing well and what they can improve upon. So cushioning the blow really means being specific first about what people are doing well, then saying these are the areas you can improve, and then the third step in that process is saying this is a roadmap of how I think you can improve. Other groups, much like Gen Xers, if they were told they had to fix something, they had to sink or swim, and they learned how to fix it by themselves. That kind of communication tactic, it just doesn't motivate a younger generation to improve. Helping them with a roadmap does. And the final step in feedback here is to ask questions, to make it a dialogue, to make this a conversation, because when that happens, a millennial will really feel heard because their manager is asking questions instead of just diving right into the feedback. If you want a very specific way to do this, I would recommend the 5-word performance review. This is where you ask someone, coworker, team member, manager, for 5 words. 2 to 3 can be positive, 2 to 3 can be negative. You go meet somewhere. You can have a walking meeting, you can go to a coffee shop, you can go to lunch, and you just talk about the words. It doesn't have to be an hour, it can be 30 minutes. Talk through it. When you're done with the conversation, you can crumple up that piece of paper the words were on and throw it away. It doesn't have to go through HR. It's just a very simple, easy way to have consistent feedback. I've heard this be very successful for Gen Xers because this was created by Gen Xers, this 5-word performance review, but it's also a really good way to be honest and also have specific positives to cushion the blow for millennials. All right, so that's Gen Xers. I'm going to open it up really quickly one more time to see if there's any questions before I talk about millennials managing millennials. Okay, so this goes back actually to a little bit earlier. Does a micro move require a salary increase or just a new experience? So the micro move, a salary increase doesn't hurt. I think that it's really good to offer it. However, if you can't offer it, explain why and when you can. There are some millennials who are going to want money a little bit more than others, and they could be skeptical of what you're doing. So if you're just honest about it right up front, then you might not need the salary increase. A lot of companies actually say things like, we're going to keep giving you micro moves and you're not going to get a salary increase for 2 years. So it's pretty clear in the beginning. It's a good question. All right, and the next question here, can you give an example of the 5-word review? Yes, I get asked this question a lot. I have to be honest, it really depends on the person that you're meeting with. That's where I can get to some psychological factors. But you know, the 5 words could be, if you're looking for the negatives, it could be timeliness, as in you're not being timely. It could be talkative, which is you're talking to your coworkers too much. You need to focus on your work a little bit. Another word could be client relationships. That's a positive one, like you're doing really well with client relationships. Honesty, you're being really, really honest with people. And the other one could be something like hashtag work family. Like even though you're really talkative with your peers, you're developing a really good family relationship with them. It really depends on who you are. You know, if you aren't someone who uses hashtag in your normal vernacular, don't go in and say that. That's weird. But it is kind of just, there's a lot of different things you can do there. What message do you send to millennials on how to work with Gen X and boomers? Deborah, that's a very good question. This presentation is actually not designed that way. We have an entire other programs about millennials working with other generations. We call it Millennial Boot Camp, but we typically just flip this conversation around. So with millennials, you know, I mentioned that with boomers, for example, they really care about formality, not extreme formality, but more so than other generations. So we could say to millennials, you know, take a look at your slang that you use on a regular basis. If you do something and someone says thank you, your natural response might be to say, oh, no problem. To other generations, they might be thinking, of course it's no problem. It's your job. You could say, you're welcome. And I've shared that, I'm sharing that example because I usually say that when I'm with millennials, and you can see that it's the first time they've ever heard that because they don't think about their slang that way. So that's kind of what we do, is we shine light on the blind spots for millennials with other generations. Okay, cool. With Gen Xers too, sorry, I'll answer that as well. We usually say that it's important to showcase your independence and that you can do things really independently and on your own without frequent check-ins. All right, don't see any other questions coming in, but of course there will be time still at the end here. Millennials managing millennials. We call this the twin dynamic, and you might be thinking again, wow, Lindsay Lohan was super good in that movie. What happened to her? But really what we're thinking about when we look at the twin is this dynamic of millennials moving into leadership positions more so than generations in the past at the age in which they're doing it. That never was the case so much, but because of the demographic shifts occurring in organizations, with boomers retiring or moving to different positions and a smaller population of Gen Xers, millennials just by number are moving into management positions. And managing millennials, there can be some pitfalls, like I'm your age, but I'm the boss. And this is can get really awkward. It's like millennials, they move into management and all of a sudden they're thinking, okay, so now I have to completely change who I am and how I built a relationship with you before. It doesn't work anymore, and I'm the boss, and you're a different millennial than me, and that just creates an animosity that isn't as productive. Whereas if relying on the strength of #WorkFamily, like I said, this can be really powerful. And this we see being really beneficial when it comes to recruiting millennials, is relying on this strength. A blind spot right now we're seeing in many industries is people are still asking the question, how do we attract top talent? What can we do? How do we attract top talent who are 35 and who are 23? How do we get these people? And we always start by saying this quote, culture eats strategy for breakfast. Some of you may have heard this quote before. It's not a new quote. It's been around for a long time. And the reason this is so important is because when millennials are looking at where they want to work, according to a LinkedIn study, the #1 thing they want to know about your company is your culture and your values. They are looking for a place where they can walk in, be their authentic selves, and work for a company that invites that. When you are thinking about your culture, how do you describe it? What 3 words do you use? How do you describe it in your job description, in your interviews, on social media? Is it all about the business, or is it about the experience of what it's like to work inside your organization? I encourage you to sell the experience. You know, back to that manufacturing facility I mentioned earlier, the experience is not for the wastewater. I mean, the experience is not about putting something together and making phone calls and selling a product. The experience is about, we're here together with people of like mind who are joined together in a similar mission. Our workspace is designed like XYZ. Our outings are designed like this. We do this for lunch. It's like this in the morning. It's like this in the afternoon when people leave. It's about the feeling of working there and not really the work as much itself. And this is where I encourage you to use your current workforce as brand ambassadors. For people who are going out to job fairs, people who are going out and hiring, who are doing the interviewing, ask the person who's been there for a year or two that's really passionate about their work to be the face of your company. There's a lot of organizations who, when they use these millennials as brand ambassadors to go out and attract top talent, it works. There is a tire company, again, we're talking a non-sexy industry, they sell tires, but they use millennials as brand ambassadors, and once they started doing that, they had a 30% increase in applications for their jobs because people could see themselves there and they never could before. Another example of finding a way to encourage the experience in brand ambassadors is designing videos and putting them into your job descriptions. An electric company put videos in their job descriptions and they had a 40% increase in applications. Really simple things that just shows this is what this experience is like, so now you don't have to question it anymore. All right, and on that note, I do want to say all millennials are not the same. Attracting millennials, retaining millennials, we really like to focus on the fact that there are early millennials and late millennials. So early millennials can kind of be like this how are you desktop computer, that's what defined the generation. Late millennials, it's TLDR. If you don't know what TLDR means, it's too long, didn't read. And this is a vernacular and a way of thinking and working that they carry. We've done a lot of research in splitting these groups up into early millennials and recessionist millennials. Typically what we find is early millennials, they grew up with technology when it was really in the dial-up stage. So they're the ones who, when they're trying to find an answer to something in the work environment, the first person they're going to ask is just that, a person, an expert. Recessionist millennials, because of the technology that they grew up with, getting Wi-Fi in high school, they're going to ask the internet before they ask a person if they have a question. The other difference we look at with this group, of course, is in the name itself. Early millennials, they graduated from high school, graduated from college before the recession, and they were told to dream their entire lives, and they dreamt, and they went out into the world, and they got a great job. Recessionist millennials graduated from high school and college post-recession, and the message they got was dreaming is very expensive. You've got to be more realistic. You have to focus more on finances, otherwise you won't be able to succeed. One of the questions we asked in our national survey is just to finish this sentence. And early millennials said, my work is a reflection of my identity. Recessionist millennials said, my work is something I do to pay the bills. Now you could look at that and think, well, yeah, recessionists are young. Of course, their life right now is paying bills. And I would like to think that's true, but we've done too much qualitative research and too many focus groups that I have to say that this is truly their mentality. Recessionist millennials are just more driven by the financial stability first and then everything else, whereas early millennials are not quite as much driven in the same way. Still, certain factors are the same for them. They want to make a difference, they want work-life balance, but this subtle difference here I really wanted to point out. Okay, I've just spent a lot of time talking about millennials. If you want any more information, just kind of a quick thing about us and what we do, we have this generational readiness assessment, which is where we go into an organization and we study the different kinds of factors about recruiting and retaining. And we have a score that we find in organizations, it's the Generational Readiness Index, and we score organizations on how well they're doing in recruiting young talent and retaining it. And then we work with companies to improve that score. And so that's what all these solutions are when it comes to consulting, training, writing and research, keynotes and presentations, and training certification. So that's just a little bit about us, and you can absolutely contact Bridgeworks if you have any questions. We did have a book that recently came out this year, Managing Millennials for Dummies. You can find us at generations.com. And I will bring this screen up again, but I am curious now, we've got about 5 minutes just to answer any other questions that you have. So I'm going to take a look at what's coming in here. All right, so do you have any other resources you can provide on millennials, managing millennials? Yes, so the book I actually just mentioned has an entire chapter on millennial leadership, and it goes pretty deep into that dynamic. It also goes into the dynamic of millennials managing Generation Edge. I'm going to give a brief preview of them afterwards, but we are forecasting that that's going to be a challenge for millennials. So I would recommend the book. You can go to our website. We have blogs on it, generations.com. And if you have any other questions about that you're not finding, just contact us, and I'd be happy to send you links and information about that. Okay. All right, so I'm a millennial Gen X cusper. My millennial employees try to build a friendship relationship with me. I find it awkward. And when I need to get tough on their performance mistakes, they seem shocked their friend is giving tough feedback. What's the deal? Suggestions. I'm laughing because this is such a true dynamic that exists. You know, part of the deal, I guess, of kind of what's happening is it was pretty understood in the past that when you went to work, there was a boundary between your personal and professional life. It's like who you are at work, it's not who you are at home. And that started to blur a little bit with Gen Xers, but part of the blurring is the work dynamic of work hard, play hard. Like, let's get all of our work done, and then we can talk about our weekends if we have time. But I'm not going to make time in the middle of the workday to talk about our weekends, to talk about our kids. That's for later. So building a relationship for a lot of Gen Xers is like you come in, you build a relationship through the work that you are doing, and then you can build a personal relationship afterwards, but that's not critical to getting work done. For millennials, it's very different. They come in and they're like, I need to build a work relationship first with you, a personal relationship, excuse me, and then a work relationship. So part of where that's coming from is that, yeah, they want to be your friend. Suggestion I would give you is to be incredibly explicit in expectations. And what I mean by that is saying something like, this is like really micro kind of tip here, but it's saying something like, I don't want to be friends with you on Facebook. It's nothing personal. I just don't like to be friends with people that I work with. It could also be, you know what, I'm going to be really honest with you. I'm going to be very direct, but when I am direct, I'm direct with heart. I'm not trying to be rude. I'm trying to help you out because I do care about you. And just kind of setting it up like that is in setting up why you're being straight to the point, why you're giving them tough feedback, the way that you're giving it, they'll receive it in a different way. So those are kind of the two suggestions that I would give there. All right, and if you're not supposed to text thanks, period, unless you're mad, how should you convey gratitude? Great question. I mean, from a simple syntax, you can put an exclamation point after the thanks, and that pretty much clears it up. Or you can be really specific in what you're saying thanks for. Or you can just have this conversation like you saw this webinar and you heard about thanks period and then just ask what people think about it. For some, that doesn't mean anything to them. For others, it does. So that's what I would suggest. All right. Doesn't look like there are any other questions coming in. So what I will do is I'll give you a 1-minute preview into Generation Edge and then I'll have Marissa close it out. All righty, Gen Edgers. We call them Gen Edge because of a variety of reasons. You've probably seen the name Gen Z or iGen out there, and those names are fine. We really don't know what name will stick with this group because they're in their formative years. They're still kind of becoming who they are, so we don't know exactly who they are yet. But we chose Gen Edge because they are on an edge. They're the last generation of a Caucasian majority in the United States, and they also have an edge. They have grown up in a pretty scary world with access to things going on all the time, so they've had to build a certain kind of resiliency to what's going on in that world. Now, when we look at this generation today and who they are and how they're changing the workforce, there's two big things I want to point out. One is they're being raised by Gen X parents. So they're being raised by Xers who are saying, hey kids, love you. I'm gonna be really honest with you about stuff. So, honey, you're playing soccer. You're not very good at that. Why don't you play basketball? Because you're just so much better at that. They're being brutally honest. So Gen Edgers are being very pragmatic and honest with themselves about how they're deciding things for their future. The other key piece that we're seeing is different is their use of technology. It's been found millennials can communicate across 2 screens at one time. Gen Edgers can communicate across 5. If you have a Gen Edger at home, you see this. They can be working on their homework and they have FaceTime up and their computer is on and the TV is on and you ask them a question in the kitchen and they can answer your question because they can so easily switch tasks. Other generations, we can switch tasks, but we lose a lot of information in the middle ground when that happens. Edgers lose less information and can switch tasks faster. So in a work environment, we're thinking that these multiple screens and the ability to do many things at one time is going to be very important. However, because they've grown up with a very clear direction from their parents and very clear instruction limitations from technology, they respond very well to very clear to-do lists. So if you want a Gen Edger to do something, you say, I want you to do these 10 things. And then Gen Edgers will stop before they do anything else when they finish that. So if you actually want them to do 15, tell them 15 things to do, and they'll do it well, and they'll do it quickly. And finally, just something to think about as you go into the future and you leave this webinar. We asked in our survey, does your generation struggle with in-person communication at work? 74% of Gen Edgers said yes. They're not oblivious to the fact that in-person communication is not their strongest communication style. Training on social skills is something they will be looking for at work, and that's really okay. They're looking for other generations to guide them in the best way to navigate certain workplace relationships. All right, so with that, just want to say thank you so much for being on here and listening to all of this information. Like I said, please feel free to contact us if you have further questions. And you know, when we talk about generations, I always like to say we're still talking about humans. We're more alike than we are different, but it's just helpful to know how to utilize those differences. So thank you very much, and I'll pass it back to you, Marissa.
I want to just extend a very hearty thanks to Hannah for that engaging and insightful discussion. I know I was nodding along with like everything that you said, so thank you so much for being with us today, for sharing the research and insights that Bridgeworks has generated over the years. And hopefully those listening were able to take a lot away from today's conversation. We will be sharing a link to the recording out later this afternoon, so watch out for that if you'd like to share it with coworkers or friends or family. And again, just a reminder, we have one more fall webinar coming up on November 29th, The Art of Tactful Self-Promotion at Work. So we hope you can join us for that conversation, and stay tuned for the spring announcement of our webinars soon. And then again, just another thank you to our members for their support and helping us make sure that programs like this continue. That's all for us for now, so we're signing off, and thank you again for joining us.